Hey guys, how's it going? So I found this awesome video. It comes from a longer 1.5 hour debate. So I'm going to break it down into 3 segments and I'll upload the first one today. And basically it's talking about the whole campus rape epidemic, or the so-called campus rape crisis. And it's an awesome panel of people that discuss this topic and debate on it. And I think you guys will really enjoy it. So if you guys want to see more long videos like this, long debates, let me know in the comments because I can certainly do that. So thanks, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
This first debate in our strand called Feminism and its Discontents. This session is called Rape Culture, Menace or Myth. My name's Luke Gittos. I'm the law editor for Spiked Online, and I've written a book called Why Rape Culture is a Dangerous Myth, so you know where I stand. But you don't want to hear from me. We've got a fantastic panel to discuss this issue. First to speak will be Ian Dunt. Ian's the editor of politics.co.uk, which is a fantastic magazine. I recommend you check it out, covering all sorts, covering everything, I think, pretty much. And you're a reporter in Westminster as well. Is sort of the day job, is that right?
Yeah, indeed.
Great. And he's also a very nice guy. Second to speak after Ian will be Dr. Caitlin Mendes. Caitlin is a researcher in feminism and media at the University of Leicester, and she's the author of Slut Walks, Feminism, Activism and the Media. Third to speak will be Sue Edwards from the University of Buckingham. Sue is a professor of law, an author of a number of books, one entitled Gender and the Legal Process. And
you missed off the sex, that's important.
Oh.
Sex and gender in the legal process.
Typical. So gender, sex and the legal process. I have to say a particular thank you to Sue because the speaker who's advertised in the brochure couldn't make it. So it's appropriate that we airbrush him from history, forget he ever existed, and thank you very much, Sue, for attending this morning and filling in the gaps. And then last to speak will be Christina Summers, who will be known to many of you in the room as the factual feminist, YouTube star, I think it's fair to say, enormous following on Twitter, and is also a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. So thank you very much to all of our panel, and without further ado, Ian, do you want to get us started?
So rape is one of those issues, really, that should be incredibly simple. It should just have one interesting dimension, which is how do we reduce rape and sexual assault? And the fact that it has become so interesting in a variety of other ways means that something is going terribly wrong. The other ways, I think, in which it's become interesting is really twofold. One of them is our general inability as a society to have honest, frank conversations about sex, and that extends most particularly, in this case, to our inability to deliver effective sexual education classes in schools. And the other is a sort of political symbolism that rape offers, especially within feminism and within student protest movements. On the first, there are signs of our inability to think clearly about this topic and to have educated people clearly, just merely by the fact that the quite serious data indicates that we have 15% of rapes are only being reported to the police. That is a very low figure. There are some explanations, of course, say, well, maybe some women like to deal with this more informally and maybe they don't think it was serious enough. And in some cases that may be true. Nevertheless, that figure suggests that we have a serious problem, that there is a quite significant degree of victim blaming still in our society now, and that some of that victim blaming takes place from women themselves. And you'll quite often, when you speak to women who have clearly been raped, hear things like, well, by that point I'd already taken him home and my top was off, so, I was sort of responsible in some way, as if consent ends at a set point and anything that happens beyond that is no longer the responsibility of the aggressor. So we do have a significant problem there. On the other hand, there is, I think, quite a big problem with the way that this issue has been hijacked by parts of usually campus feminist groups. For instance, with the suggestion that there is some thriving rape culture in university campuses. Now, most of that comes from the Hidden Marks, which is this NUS report from 2010. Very serious commentators bring this report up all the time. I mean, as Luke pointed out consistently in his book, it is utter nonsense. I mean, it's, 2,000, just above 2,000 self-selecting people online. This is not serious research you could credit. And in fact, the information from the States suggests that for the age group going to university, there's actually higher rates of sexual assault outside of campus than there are on campus. It's not to suggest that there is no problem at all. It is that the fixation on this idea of campus as this uniquely dangerous place doesn't have any statistical backing and is triggering a considerable degree of legislative and cultural criticism. So there's this pushing of the idea for instance, that we can clamp down on songs and on book titles, blurred lines is the obvious response, because of this crisis. So this creation of an engine of moral panic is actually serving a wider sort of censorship agenda. That would not be particularly troubling, really, if it wasn't for the fact that actually I believe that makes sexual assault more likely and harder to defeat. I think it does it in the following ways. When we start seeing mandatory consent classes for students, that seems to me a completely inane and dangerous notion. The problem with people raping is not that they are too stupid to understand what consent is. Consent is not a difficult concept. The problem is that they are bastards, and that is why they commit rape. So you see, for instance, there was a video, just a dreadful video from the States, which was showing a woman who was asleep and a variety of guys in a party having sex with her. And one of the guys said afterwards, well, I didn't understand that was rape. A guy watching said, I didn't understand that was rape because there was no violence. See, I don't believe him. I think he did know exactly what that was, and he chose to do nothing about it because he didn't have the guts, not because he's not intelligent enough to understand consent. Consent classes, to me, do not seem like an answer. More pernicious than that are these consent contracts, which are being handed out in boxes to students, where, you know, just before you have sex, you're supposed to take a photo of the two of you having signed this document. I mean, beyond the fact that that shows no recognition for what human life is actually like, or what we would wish it to be like. It is also very, very dangerous, because, of course, it suggests that in court, if that goes on and the guy actually acts more aggressively, or she decides she doesn't want to do it, or they said they would use a condom and then he decides to go ahead and not, actually in court that'll be used against her, because it's a sign that, you know, she did give consent. Consent is not something that is frozen in a moment of time, from which point on nothing applies. So actually I think some of these developments are extremely pernicious and make it harder to deal with the very, very basic and simple thing of what we need to do with rape, which is, of course, cut down on sexual assaults. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Caitlin.
One thing I want to actually start by saying, and this is something maybe we can discuss with the audience, is what is rape culture? And it's really hard to define because I think it's often conflated with lad culture, which is what we often hear talked about as being really rampant upon campuses. So maybe this is something that we can open up to discussion later. But, you know, in trying to kind of provide a broad definition, I would say rape culture is, of course, a culture in which sexual assault is rife. I mean, we have very different statistics, but roughly I think it's about 1 in 4 women, 1 in 5 women, and there are some statistics which indicate it's around 1 in 6 men. Now, we know that these statistics differ depending on the population. For example, women and men from marginalized groups who are, for example, in care, who are from ethnic minorities, they have higher incidences of rape. People of a certain age, so younger people, for example, are more likely to get raped than older people, for example. So rape culture, of course, means that we live in a culture in which sexual assault happens. But for me, when we talk about rape culture, it's about more than that. So it's about the prominence of rape jokes and violence against women, okay, about how these sorts of issues are seen as funny, how they're trivialized, how if you go into Facebook, you can find pages like, beat a bitch up today. Okay, so how this is seen as normal. It's about the rise in pressure for young women to engage in sexting, okay, to take photos of themselves, sexually explicit photos of themselves, and send it to young men. It's about the prevalence of sexual and street harassment. It's about the rise of revenge porn, so ex-partners posting photos of their former partners, sexually explicit photos of themselves online. And I think rape culture also is about sexualized banter. So for me, what underpins rape culture, and what I find really problematic about it, it's male entitlement. I think that's probably the key to it. Yes, some part of rape culture also involves misogyny, the general hatred of women, but I think male entitlement explains a lot of it. So if we think about date rape, or rape that happens between acquaintances, spouses, partners, which is the majority of rape, I don't necessarily think it's always about men trying to punish women or exert violence against women, although that is the case. I think it's because men feel as though they are entitled to women's body. Because the woman went home with the man, she took her top off. So the man thinks, okay, well, you took your top off, that's a sign that I am entitled to your body. Or we went on a date, I bought you dinner, I paid for your drinks. I am therefore entitled to your body. So entitlement is a really key aspect for me of rape culture. So it's not just male entitlement to women's bodies, but also to their time, their affection, and their attention. So street harassment, perhaps, explains this. So men feel as though I can make comments to any woman on the street, and I expect her to respond positively towards them. So if I say hi, hey beautiful, I expect her to respond. Now, perhaps what I also want to say is that I don't think that living in a rape culture means that every man is going to go out and commit rape, okay? And same thing, this entitlement that I'm talking about, I don't think all men feel entitled to women's bodies, their time, and their attention. So we saw this kind of debate played out after the Isla Vista shootings in California, where Elliot Rodger gunned down 6 women. And in the manifesto he left behind, he stated that he wanted to punish women for not giving themselves to him sexually. So there are some cases where some men feel very entitled, but there are lots of other men who don't feel entitled at all. But we know that all women live in a world where this entitlement is real, where they feel pressured to respond to men. And if they don't, there can be some very dire consequences, such as murder, such as assault, such as groping, okay? So men often feel so entitled to women's bodies that they feel as though they can just grope them whenever they want, in nightclubs, in public transportation. And if women don't respond in a way that men want them to, women are also often subject to verbal abuse. So I don't know how many women in this room can raise their hand and say, you know, a man hit on me, and when I refused him, it went from, hey, beautiful, to, hey, you cunt. Well, you're a bitch, you're ugly, I wouldn't want to fuck you anyways. Okay, that's actually a really, really common response. It also leads to men following women. They feel so entitled to have access to these women that they follow them home. So maybe I just want to finish by saying that there are some very serious implications of living in a rape culture, where harassment and sexual assault are normal parts of everyday life. So one, I think we actually do have an awareness, and this is maybe where I'm going to differ, is I think there is actually a general a lack of awareness of what rape can be. So particularly for women, this is where I agree with you. I think there's a lot of cases where women get raped, and if it's a boyfriend, if it wasn't violent, if it doesn't fit that narrative of a stranger on the street using violence, and I fought against him with all my might, a lot of women don't necessarily recognize that to be rape. And I think it's the same with men. I think men often or sometimes feel entitled. So if it's a girlfriend, if it's someone you've slept with before, when this date rape happens, you know, they just felt entitled to their body, and I don't think they always recognize that it actually was assault. There's also evidence that bystanders don't necessarily recognize what it is. So, and this is maybe where the blurred lines happen, where, okay, we understand if a man penetrating a woman with his penis is rape, but what about if he uses his fingers? Okay, and we saw evidence of this with Steubenville, Ohio, where there was a teenager who was drunk, passed out at a party, her body was kind of transported, and a lot of men penetrated her with her fingers. Well, there were lots of people who took videos of this, who witnessed this, and I think people didn't recognize that that was rape. And so I think that's actually where consent comes in, these consent training comes in. We also have a lot of evidence that people don't take rape and sexual assault seriously, or rape culture seriously. So sexual harassment, well, you should just be grateful for the compliment. He was just trying to say hello. He was just trying to be nice. We know that victim blaming is a key feature of rape culture. And where rape is seen as not only natural, well, men are so innately sexual that sometimes they can't help but, you know, throw themselves at a woman. But it's also seen as inevitable and sometimes excusable. And, you know, maybe this is something we'll pick up on as well, finally, that there are often light sentences for those who are convicted. So I have lots of evidence of cases where men either receive very light sentences or no sentences at all, even in cases where the assault has been filmed, okay, where there was one case in particular, a man drugged and raped his wife and filmed it. She only found out about it because she found the films. The judge convicted him of rape but gave him no jail time and told her that she needed to forgive him in his sentence. So I'll finish there.
Okay, thanks, Caitlin. Sue.
Yes, well, there is a rape culture. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Whilst there's an increasing number of women who are more willing to report rape, when we come to look at the conviction rate actually is no different than it was in the 70s. So we can't put our faith in the courts in terms of their ability to protect women. But it's not only the courts that are a great concern. I think we need to be concerned about the continuing representation of women within the media and largely within pornography. It is of some significance, I think, that in 2015 it was passed, a new law was passed that actually regulated violent rape in pornography. And what we've got to look at is the desexualization of the whole of the culture, in the sense that it doesn't see that representations of women in the media and representations of women in film are actually sexualized. So in fact, in a sense, we're becoming desexualized. That's my point. We're becoming desexualized and desensitized to the fact that there's a continuing sexualization that's going on and that is actually affecting all of us in the way in which we respond. I just want to refer to a number of examples. I mean, there was one example going back to 2002 of Madonna's video in Die Another Day. I don't know whether any of you saw this, where Madonna was tied up, writhing in a Latin American prison, being bound and gagged. And the response to that was, what a fabulous video, how erotic that is. And of course, Madonna survives. But as Amnesty International knows, and any other human rights organization knows, these women don't survive. And so there's a continual feeding, whether it's in promotional videos, whether it's in mainstream culture, as well as within pornography, of the sexualization of women, rather in the way that Andrea Dworkin so reputedly put it, that it doesn't matter what you do to her, she will always enjoy it. And that kind of narrative is continually being presented within the media and within mainstream media. So what does that do? Well, what it does in the courtroom, and I'm currently working on looking at strangulation, which in fact, if you look at murders on women and partners, I'm talking about female partners within what we call a domestic violence context, a large proportion of those women are actually strangled. And some of those strangulations are being sexualized, that they are being put forward by defense counsel, although defense counsel acceptedly are putting forward the narratives of those who have killed these women. And the argument has been that, in fact, she desired that it heightens sexual libido. And in fact, it's not just death, it's the whole gamut of violence against women where there is an argument, and it's put out there in media, advertising, film industry, as well as in the courtroom, that actually women desire what some people are calling rough sex. And in fact, that is a narrative that is presented from the mouth and the lips and the voice of the perpetrator. And yet again, we see the silencing of women and women's narratives on this, and we see the extolling, if you like, of the male narrative, that she desired it. One significant case in 2006 was the case of Graham Cutts. It was a case against Graham Cutts, who is now serving a life sentence for murder of Jane Longhurst, and that was precisely his argument. Fortunately, the jury did not accept it and convicted him of murder. So he is serving a life sentence, and that had a change in terms of how it influenced the legislation in terms of looking at the impact of violence in pornography. But in fact, he was an avid viewer of pornography. He'd looked at many sites of strangulation before he went on to kill her. And it's quite clear from my research that I'm currently doing on strangulation in some of these cases that there's a history of strangulation and sexualized strangulation against women. So when we come to look at rape, we have a rape culture, and I'll sum up now before the yellow card rises. I'm told it does. We have a rape culture, and that culture actually still blames women, still holds women responsible for violence against them, still doesn't sufficiently protect them. Actually, few men are convicted. There are the same percentage of men convicted today in the courts as there were back in the 70s. I looked at the statistics. So the conviction rate hasn't improved. In fact, the courtroom discussions in the courtroom and the cross-examination in the courtroom is even more robust, with defense counsel saying, well, you consented even where there is violence, because the argument is that actually women like violence and, quote, unquote, it's rough sex. So in fact, it's more difficult to actually get a conviction. So in fact, looking at my lifetime in this area of research, my PhD actually was on rape several years ago, I don't actually see any real changes in the way in which women are presented, although, of course, there are examples of women's emancipation across a range of areas, I don't see that actually women are represented any differently than they were. The fight is still on, and we do have a rape culture, and I absolutely disagree with the first speaker that it's perhaps not something we should worry too much about. We should worry about it. Worry for our sisters, worry for our daughters, worry for our female partners, worry for our grandchildren, worry for our grandmothers, that in fact we live in a rape culture and women are no longer safe.
Thank you, Sue. And Christina.
We don't live in a rape culture. We live in a culture where it is rife with misinformation, if you will, and propaganda. And we are saturated with propaganda, and it has reached a point where I see now on the campus, and maybe a little bit here on this panel, what I would describe as a kind of moral panic, a contagion of hysteria. It brings to mind, I'm not going to say the Salem witch trials, although on American campuses I would say that I'm seeing, it looks as though I'm seeing the equivalent of accusers of people being accused of witchcraft from which there is no defense. It's a contagion of hysteria, and as with other panics in the past, I would compare it more to the panic over satanic cults in daycare centers in the 1980s. And who would come to the defense of people accused of, using children in diabolical cults, and no one wanted to defend them, and yet it was a completely manufactured crisis, promoted by, of course, the media, and in this case, in the daycare center case in the 80s, it started in California. Also, a lot of feminists were involved because it sort of fit the narrative of a kind of feminism of paranoia, that there were these invisible crimes everywhere, pervasive. It was a culture of predation. This is so false. Let's begin to look at the statistics, and then I will take a look at the results of this panic. How many times have you heard 1 in 4, 1 in 5 women are victims of sexual assault? You began to hear this in the late 80s and 90s. The methodology for finding this epidemic was perfected by Professor Mary Koss. And what she did was, you don't ask people, you don't have a sample of subjects that are representative of the population, and you don't ask direct questions. That's done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which sort of sets the gold standard for research, and I'll tell you what they found in a moment. What Mary Koss did was she would ask sort of vaguely worded questions to a non-representative sample of students and declare a rape crisis. So you don't say, have you been raped, have you been sexual assaulted? You will say things. I mean, it's a mix of questions that I find acceptable, and then questions that are just vague. Have you ever had sex because you didn't want to, because a man gave you alcohol or drugs? And anyone that said yes was counted as a rape victim in her survey. I can imagine cases where that would be rape. We would all agree that it was a horrible violation. But there are cases where you wouldn't know. And I found it very interesting that in her research, the majority of the young women did not think it was a crime, and many of them dated their alleged rapists again. So this is all very, so that alerted me to the problems with this methodology. Now it's used over and over again. People will ask subjects, a non-representative group of subjects, vaguely worded questions, and find an epidemic of assault. What happens when you ask a truly representative sample? And what happens when you are rigorous researchers? When you're from the Bureau of Justice Statistics in the Justice Department in the United States, well, the numbers go down. And you find not only that, but as of, I think, this year or last year, rape, along with most violent crime, is at a 41, 42-year low. And it's not 1 in 4 or 1 in 5, but more like 1 in 50 for college students. Now that is too many. 1 in 50 is too many. But it is not epidemic. It is a serious problem. It is a hateful crime. And I, for one, and I hope I speak for everyone in this room, consider it an abominable crime for which a person should be severely punished. But because it's such a horrible crime, we have to be vigilant and careful about false accusations. And they happen. And we are seeing now, because of these false statistics, and it wasn't just the false statistics. You have this body of egregiously false information at the heart of the campus rape culture crusade, and you have twisted theories. And we had a big fight, and I consider myself a feminist, and I'm a feminist. I was teaching feminist philosophy in the late 80s and early 90s, and there was a big battle within feminism. And our side won the argument, and by our side I mean sort of pro-sex feminists who wanted, saw women as moral agents and equal to men, and we cared a lot about getting the truth about what was going on, and something like young women involved in sexting. As a mother, I don't approve of it, but as a human being, I can imagine these young women are not simply molded by the society to send their boyfriends pictures. They might just think it's fun, and these things may just be a phenomenon of freedom. And as far as people engaging on the street, a lot of it can be annoying. But if someone says, "Hello, beautiful," that depends on who you are. You might like it, or you might resent it. And then there are people who can be very threatening. But to put it all in the same category, and not to attend to the fact that there's also a class component. I know in Washington, D.C., there are places you can go and walk, and you would definitely be harassed by the men sitting there. And it's a lot of dressed for success women walking through, and there are homeless men that will call out and say, "Hi, beautiful," and so forth. So I just don't go along with this idea, but I think this is part of the panic that all manifestations of sexuality are now seen with suspicion. It's part of this invisible crime. And we have the trigger warnings, and we have the women going to safe spaces. And again, as someone who comes from a school of feminism that sees women as agents and the equal to men, and there were people on my side, Camille Paglia and Daphne Patai, Kathy Young, and we thought we won the argument. But the other side quietly took all the assistant professorships. And this paranoid school of sex-phobic feminism, I call it fainting couch feminism, because it's sort of women are constantly being put upon by men, and we must, rush to protect. And when I say this, I am not trivializing in any way the crime of rape, because it's because I take it so seriously that I am distressed by this trivialization. But I think if you care about victims, and you care about women and men, then you want an accurate view of reality. And this rape culture feminism is a distorted picture, and it now has victims. The victims are, it seems like every week now we have another case on our campuses of a young man that was put through what can only be described as a Kafkaesque procedure, kangaroo court. How am I doing? Do I have
1 minute?
Well, 1 minute. Yeah. I'll just tell you that this, as I said before, you take bad information, and history is one long lesson on the danger of combining misinformation and moral fervor. And you get fanaticism. If you have good information and you have moral energy, you get progress. But right now, we have fervor, we have panic, we have hysteria, I believe, and what this yields, this isn't going to yield solutions. This isn't going to help rape victims. If you want to help rape victims, the very top thing on your list should be, for example, rape kits and the police having better training and to stop this horrible crime. But when it's talking about a campus like Oberlin College or Swarthmore, it's our most elite campuses where the women are most at fear and organized. And they are the safest places in the world, and these women are among the most self-determining and free women, and yet they are being taught that they are victims. And it's this combination of, it's propaganda and twisted theory. We do not live in a rape culture. We live in a free society, and bad things can happen, and they do happen to men and women, but we have to stop the panic. Thank you.